All right, then, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome, everyone. We're very happy. I'm Lisa. I'm the general manager at Buffalo Street Books, and we've been really enjoying the virtual events. We've found them to be far more intimate and connecting than we would have expected, and we're very happy to be back at them. We had taken a short break, canceled a few events because we wanted to leave the airspace free for the conversations around anti-racism work that were happening, and we want to keep doing that as well. We've got lots of upcoming events that will, some relate and some don't, but we're going to keep moving forward with all the literary and those conversations as we're going forward, and we're really excited about this event tonight. Okay, so today we have Sara Schaff here with her brand new collection of stories, The Invention of Love. It's published by Split Lit Press, and also has another collection called Say Something Nice About Me, which was a CLMP Firecracker Award finalist in fiction, and a 2017 Next Generation Indie Book Award finalist for short fiction. Sara is a graduate of Brown University and the MFA program at the University of Michigan, and is an assistant professor of English at SUNY Plattsburgh. And we're very happy to have Nafissa Thompson-Spires. Nafissa earned a PhD in English from Vanderbilt University and an MFA in creative writing from the University of Illinois. Her debut story collection, Heads of the Colored People, is the winner of the Penn Open Book Prize, the LA Times Art Seidenbaum Book Prize, the Hurston Wright Award for Fiction, and the Whiting Award. The collection was also longlisted for the 2018 National Book Award in Fiction. She's an assistant professor at Cornell University. So we're going to have Sara and Nafissa are both going to read short selections, and then they have a conversation among themselves. And if we have time, we'll take some Q&A at the end. So Nafissa, I think you were going to read first. Welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for that introduction, and Sara for inviting me to do this. I appreciate it. And Eleanor for all of your work in organizing it. I'm going to read a little bit from my collection, Heads of the Colored People. This is from the titular story, which is Heads of the Colored People, 4 fancy sketches, 2 chalk outlines, and no apology. And I can talk more about where that title comes from if people are interested. But it's a network narrative about a Black cosplayer who gets shot down at a comic book convention, along with another man who's at the comic book convention, and he gets in a fight with this man. And so I'm going to read from the end for a change. I usually read from the beginning, but this seems like a sort of fitting day for the end. So this is part 5 of 6. 5. A well-read, self-aware, self-loving Black man with blue contact lenses and blonde hair and a periwinkle suit was shot down in Los Angeles after a reportedly violent altercation with a well-read street promoter who was also shot after police officers answered a complaint. Who was also shot here signals the afterthought that was brother man, Richard, because he was not the one with the blonde hair and the blue contact lenses, or in any way exceptional, except for his size and the things he had overcome, too many to name here. Sorry, my Kindle just went to sleep right at that moment. Let me open it again and start. Except for his size and the things he had overcome and his comic books. And you should fill in for yourself the details of that shooting as long as the constants, unarmed men, excessive force, another dead body, are included in those details. Hum a few bars of Say My Name but in third person plural if that does something for you. A few more points I should not leave to the imagination. In the chalk drawing on 15th, you can see Riley's leg kicking out like Spike Spiegel, and an additional rectangle above the outline of Richard's hand where he might have held up his comic books or a laminated mock-up. The picture the Associated Press chose came from a Throwback Thursday photo that Riley had posted on social media, a picture of him in a costume from an undergrad party, at which he wore an oversized blue shirt and a bedazzled blue bandana over cornrows. His mother and girlfriend Paris explained repeatedly that he was not dressed as a thug, but as 90s Justin Timberlake. Brother Man's picture was an old mugshot accompanied by a story that emphasized a criminal charge from 5 years ago for child support, non-payment, and tax evasion. and his penchant for false names. Both men's families would say the pictures didn't say anything, but that's not how anyone who knew them would remember them. The Neil deGrasse Tysons disagreed over the number of gunshots they heard. The one in blackface said 10, while the one with a brown face called Black said 13. The autopsies would not conclude, but there might have been marijuana in Riley's or Richard's systems at some point. 6. I think a cop shooting is too melodramatic when the story was interesting on its own, and my preoccupation with race is perhaps overdone. But it was O'Connor, I think, who said, and I say I think here more as a device to effect a sort of nonchalance, when I know in fact she said, everything that rises must converge, or something like that. Or something like that serving as another affected clause. But that makes the ending sound intentional or overdetermined when it wasn't, though I know, it was Danica Kelly who said, the way a body makes a road, or in this case, an outline, impression. How to end such a story, especially one that is this angry, like a big black fist? The voice is off-putting, all the important action happens off screen. We don't even see the shooting or the actual bodies or the video. Like that one guy in Fiction Workshop said one time, meta is so 80s. The mise on a beam is cool but overdone. This is a story of fragments, sketches. Thank you for sharing, dear author, but we regret. I concede that it might have been so much more readable as a gentle network narrative, with the cupcakes and the superheroes and the blue eyes and the 90s image patterning. But I couldn't draw the bodies while the heads talked over me, and the mosaic formed in blood. And what is a sketch but a chalk outline done in pencil or words? And what is a Black network narrative but the story of one degree of separation, of sketching the same pain over and over, wading through so much flesh, trying to draw new conclusions, knowing that wishing would not make them so. Thank you.
Thank you, Nafissa. I do want you to talk about, could you talk a little bit about the title before I read? Yeah.
Oh, sure. The title comes from James McKean Smith's work. The whole collection is in conversation with a lot of 19th century sketches by James McKean Smith and his contemporary writers or contemporaneous writers like Frederick Douglass, whose newspapers he published a lot of his work in, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, who was writing under the name Jane Rustick. And they were all kind of trying to theorize what Black citizenship would look like at the time in the 19th century. And I thought I would update that project because a lot of their concerns are the same as what we're dealing with now, voter suppression, state-sanctioned violence. But I found that there wasn't much to update. So I ended up just sort of stealing the title and playing with McKean Smith's ideas of heads of the colored people and also bodies of the colored people. And in some cases writing back to his original sketches, but in other cases just sort of taking my own liberties.
Well, I just love the idea of also just taking this idea of sketching, both in terms of written character sketches and the visual character sketches with the artist character who you didn't read from her point of view, but your characters are so beautifully visual, you know, that we see each one so distinctively that, I mean, it's just such a beautiful homage to this original project. And then just, it is new. You have updated these amazing people. So I love that. Thanks for talking about that.
Oh, thank you. Thanks.
I am going to read a story. Nafissa and I sort of, we chose our stories in tandem. This is one of the shorter stories in my collection. It's called The Man Running the Hiring Committee. You've got the search narrowed to 2 solid candidates. One man, candidate A, and one woman, candidate B. A is obviously the better fit. By all reasonable measures, he's accomplished more than most in his career. Ivy League education, glowing recommendations, paid speaking engagements, being white and straight. But it isn't just the sheen of his accomplishments or his prior experience with six-figure salaries. You genuinely like him. And when you bring him in for an all-day interview, which includes dinner at the place with the cute waitresses, it turns out everyone else likes him too. He reminds Jack of his buddies from boarding school. He's just like David's frat brothers at Duke. Ambitious, of course, but he also knows how to have a good time. Everyone agrees he's the one. Well, everyone except Jane, the woman on your hiring committee who you had to include because, well, diversity. Not to knock Jane, who's pretty enough, but a bit of a downer. I don't think we should hire him, she says. This is quintessential Jane. Why not? He's perfect. I just got a bad vibe. You try hard not to laugh. She sounds like your tween daughter. A bad vibe, Jack says. He and David exchange glances. He kept staring down my shirt when he thought I wasn't looking. Now you and David exchange glances. There's not much to look at under her shirt, for crying out loud. You don't plan to give Jane's whining a second thought, but later that night you tell your wife what Jane said while you're crawling into bed. You think you're on your way to a quick, sleep-inducing roll in the hay after a mutually satisfying laugh at Jane's expense, but your wife gives you that look. What? Listen to Jane. Jane's a killjoy, you said so yourself. You never want to invite her to our parties. The look your wife continues to give you is one you've seen all your married life. But there's something new about it. She's not just annoyed, she's fucking pissed. And suddenly you realize she might actually leave you for her hot and sensitive yoga instructor, Raphael. So the next day, imagining Raphael going down on your wife, you call up one of candidate A's recommenders, his old boss, a guy who's been at it for a long time, who knows what's what. Oh, A, he cries. Everyone loves A. He gets great results. You're about to say thanks and hang up, but you think of Jane. You think of Raphael bringing your wife breakfast in bed. You ask, was there ever any what? There's a long, potent pause. Was he ever, a creep with women? The pause extends. A's boss answers finally, slowly. Well, there were rumors. Some women didn't feel what? There were a couple of complaints to HR. Later, you repeat this information to the hiring committee. Jack frowns. So? Jane frowns. What do you mean, so? David says you can't let a couple of rumors ruin a guy's life. Right? You give an internal fist bump to Jack and David. Your wife's not going to leave you for fucking Raphael. He's got terrible BO, and your wife is very sensitive to smells. Innocent until proven guilty, right? Jack and David nod. Jane does not nod. She says, this is a goddamn job interview, not a criminal investigation. Candidate B has no rumors about misconduct following her, and she's got basically the same resume. But she's not a good fit, Jack says. She really isn't, David says. Not the best, you agree. She had a lot of ideas, and she wasn't above inserting them into the conversation. In the end, you're willing to make the call. Candidate A all the way, even if it means losing your wife. Because that's the kind of sacrifice you have to make sometimes to do what's right for your fellow man. Thanks. So I just wanted to start by asking Nafissa, I want to ask you about point of view and heads of the colored people. This is such a masterful story, and one of the things that is so genius about it is your handling of point of view, which I love that you kind of gave everyone that scope. Like, when it starts, it really feels like we're in the hands of this kind of 19th century omniscient narrator, and then you kind of then the point of view opens up a little, where we realize that narrator is actually kind of talking to us. Meaning white people. So I could you talk a little bit about how you came upon this particular point of view and how it arrived and what you were thinking as you were working through that?
Yeah, I have my PG answer and my PG-13 answer and my R answer when this question comes up. So I'll give you the PG and the R today because I'm feeling frisky.
Hit the range.
So Initially, I was thinking about playing with multiple points of view because it's kind of what James McKeown Smith does. The whole collection, his original collection, goes through many different characters, many different points of view in these short sketches. And this story is probably the closest to his own text, besides maybe another one called This Todd, in terms of being in conversation with it. It made sense to me to write this as a network narrative, though, and to start with Riley, and then to move through all of these relevant people in his life. So you also get his girlfriend's point of view as she's preparing to go to this comic book convention. You get the point of view of this character, Brother Man, whose real name is Richard, who is also preparing to go to the comic book convention, and he gets into this scuffle with Riley that's very innocent but gets misread. And I wanted us to be able to see all of these different perspectives for full context when the police shooting happens. And the argument I was sort of going for is that there's no such thing as a perfect victim. You know, when a Black person gets killed, there's always talk of whether he was a thug or she was a thug, or alternately, whether he or she was a respectable, good person that shouldn't have happened to. And I wanted to make Riley seem like the perfect victim. You know, he's blonde and blue-eyed and Black, and yet he is still killed and his body is misread in these completely ridiculous terms. And to put the culpability on the reader for making assumptions about Riley as a Black man as we go into the story, and then learning that all of those assumptions are wrong. So often the narrator turns directly to the reader, the white reader, but sometimes other kinds of readers, and says, like, you would assume that, or you might think that, or you probably did this, but you're wrong, and constantly kind of plays with the you think, but you're wrong. So that I'm disarming the reader, but also implicating them constantly throughout the story. And this is a thing that recurs throughout the collection. There are other stories that refer back to the reader as you might think, and there's an implied but that you're wrong. And I think the whole collection is trying to do that, always making the reader have to really think about assumptions and stereotypes and the ways that they read Black people and Black bodies. Our answer is that this story was kind of a middle finger to MFA programs, and I wanted to see how much I could get away with, how much my peers in my workshops would have told me was wrong as a technique in writing, or told me I couldn't get away with, and to prove that yes, I totally could. And also for that to be turning a finger back at readers and editors, that a story can totally function in the structure, and that the structure isn't novel. It's harkening back to a lot of writers who are Black who've been doing this for, you know, several centuries. George Schuyler, who was writing in the early 1930s and 40s, in his book, Black No More, is doing so much play like this. Ishmael Reed plays with all of these assumptions as well. And I was writing in conversation with them as well as James McKeown Smith.
Yeah. I like did you actually write it in when you were in grad school or after grad school?
I wrote it after, but I was still mad after grad school, so it came out then.
I mean, the anger and the weariness too comes into the transition between the kind of the direct address, but which also is kind of this omniscient third person narration, to just taking it back to the first person authorial narration is just so brilliant, you know, because it's, you know, it's like there's this, we get to see, we get to peek behind, you know, under the hood, like just to see how it's made. And it's just very, yeah, I mean, yeah, you're right. You would have gotten that meta comment.
Yeah, I used to sit on an editorial board where the director, like the main editor, said, oh, meta is so 80. So that's a direct quote about, you know, some of the responses that we would make on stories that we had under submission. And those stories would get tossed out, sometimes unfairly, just because they made one little move that people didn't feel was in vogue anymore. And it always offended me to see our meetings turn that way.
It's just a really unintelligent way of reading too, because I feel like, I don't know, when I'm talking with students and they want to try something hard and new, I feel like let's see how, you know, you're creating the own rules for your own story. You get to make those rules, and you set the parameters, and then the story teaches us how to read it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
We've all learned that the story teaches you how to read it, and I think as long as those markers are clear for a reader, a story can do whatever it wants to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. Yeah, I just love that's just totally brilliant. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Speaking of point of view, I wanted to talk about how you use second person and also how you go in and out of satire, especially in the story you just read from, but also in your story, The End of the Workshop, which is also kind of a middle finger to workshops, if we're thinking about it that way, and also to workshop leaders, to professors and instructors. So could you talk about how you chose those points of view?
So this one in second person, I mean, I was also writing from a place of deep anger and rage. And I didn't want to write from the perspective of the person who had been harmed, you know. I wanted to write to the person who was doing the harm. And so often harm is perpetuated by hiring committees, both in academia and in the workplace. And I actually originally wrote this because I thought I was going to write satire, because I thought I was going to write something funny that I was going to try to publish somewhere, like in a humor site. But I was just too, I think I was just too angry, so it turned into a more dramatic narrative. But I think that the humor in this one, and then in the End of the Workshop, keeps me engaged in the story. And I think it's just how I handle anger, or like I like to have, and if anger is driving a narrative, I like that to be there, to be a sort of a release valve somewhere for it too. And sort of the humor is for that. So yeah, this was like a failed piece of satire. You know, I wrote it to be satire, and then it was just, no, it was just too, I mean, it's on the nose. It was, I think we were talking before about this story and The End of the Workshop, both never finding homes, or End of the Workshop, never finding home. This one eventually found a home in a literary journal. But with both stories, editors were very prickly about, you know, they were very workshoppy about the stories, about this story. They were like, I don't feel like it adds to the conversation. And then, yeah, and I was telling Nafissa the other day that with The End of the Workshop, which is third person, close on a inappropriate old white male professor leading an MFA workshop, that was also rejected many times, and in one case, a female editor of a journal said, I couldn't get my male editors to accept it. They wouldn't go for it. No, so they didn't go by my satire, Nafissa.
There are those readers we're making fun of then, because I felt like both of those pieces could register as satire, even if it seemed on the nose at some level. You know, they're still engaging in social commentary, and they're doing it in a really aggressive way, especially The End of the Workshop. And I think going into the professor's point of view rather than one of the students who was suffering was a really interesting move.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, I actually started it from one of the students' perspectives. And it just, you know, it didn't work that way. You know, I felt like I needed to, you know, to take your phrase, I needed to kind of write with a bigger middle finger up in the story. And it wasn't going to really happen if it was from one of the women's perspectives.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you feel like that too? Like in your writing, how does an awareness of kind of anger fit into like the actual writing process and the revision process, and humor too? Because I mean, your stories are really also bitingly funny. Like, you know, you know, they punch me in the gut, and they also crack me up at the same time. So what's that process like for you?
It's strange. I think my stories often start or the impulse to write them often starts with anger about something, because I would say that all of my stories have some level of social commentary.
Yeah.
My sort of writing philosophy is that the work should be relevant, speak to some sort of realistic context, but also to be wildly imaginative and funny, and to get as many digs in as possible. So however those digs have to land, that's just my MO in life anyway. I'm kind of passive aggressive, and so a lot of things come out in the writing because I can't do them in real life. So the humor is kind of the other side of that. The humor is the way that I soften and disarm and kind of keep the reader guessing about where we're going, and hopefully not signaling too much where that is ahead of time. But I think they often start with anger more than they start with sadness. And there's a lot of things to be angry about, but I didn't want my collection to feel like another angry Black woman stereotype. I didn't want that to be something that people could say about it or me. And I think that's where the humor really helps cushion and help people think about things in a different way, because the goal of the collection was to show, I used to call it a compendium of Black life. And I wanted to write mostly about Black joy rather than suffering. But what I think is distinctly interesting about Black people, and that people often say about Jewish people or the Irish, is that there is a kind of ability to turn very, very, very dark content on its head and find the humor in it, even if it's, you know, a thing that no one else should be joking about, that our own people can joke about it in ways that are disarming and that are interesting. And I love that about Black culture. People can make jokes about even what's going on right now with the protests, and those jokes are only okay in a certain context, but they do help people cope. And that's kind of what I wanted the whole collection to feel like. It's pointing out the suffering, but it's bringing us back constantly to an ability to find a new perspective within the darkness.
Yeah, but it's also interesting to, and I'm just thinking about Marjorie, not today Marjorie, and but I've been all day I've been thinking about, you guys, has everyone read Not Today Marjorie? Poor woman in the DMV with her list of therapy, her therapist's advice, which includes not saying but and. So I've been thinking about that a lot. But so, and it's, you're also at the same time that you're thinking about wanting to create this compendium that includes moments of humor and joy, you're also fighting against something that most writers, white writers, you know, we're not also at the same time as we're creating, worrying about how we're going to be perceived, you know. But so it's just another layer. And I think that that's also the masterful thing about your story, is that you work that in there with that direct address, those moments of direct address where, you know, if we're smart readers, we're catching that, you know, and witnessing all the layers that go into making this book. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, Not Today Marjorie in particular was an attempt at figuring out how do we manage anger while fighting against stereotypes, and also the sort of high level of consciousness, which some, you know, Du Bois would call it double consciousness. If you're a woman, lots of people have called it triple consciousness, that Black people have to constantly be aware of not only who they really are, but what's being read about them. And if you're a woman, there's an extra layer, because it's not just race, it's gender, and it's the intersection of all of those things as well. And if you're a queer Black person or a non-binary queer Black person, it just keeps adding layers and layers of the way that you are perceived and have to constantly fight against stereotypes or not being seen at all. And so Marjorie is trying to handle her own anger in some very specific ways, and she sort of fails at the end, which I think is the fun part of that story, that there's a kind of a ironic twist after she's done all of this work, and that she still ends up acting on her anger for no reason. But if you've really paid attention, it's been building and building and building and building, and of course it's going to come out somewhere. I think that theme of the anger has to come out somewhere recurs throughout the collection. In the story about Randolph, who's sharing an office with this woman named Isabella, who's really manipulating him, there's a lot of that idea of the anger has to come out somewhere. He gets bloody noses all the time, and he gets migraines all the time, and his mentor tells him that that's basically his menstrual cycle, that it's coming out in the way that it has to come out. And it's going to come out cyclically because he's dealing with a lot of pressure on himself as a Black man, and as a Black man who's trying so hard not to be misread by everyone around him.
Yeah, I was thinking a lot. I was rereading Not Today, Marjorie again today, and I was thinking a lot about how the necessary changes have been made is like its twin story of these characters, who just the way they build and the way that as readers we're also kind of always, where you have us kind of second guessing or wondering, what has really happened, and where our sympathies kind of shift, and they get even closer to both those characters the more that the tension builds, and the more you build this brilliant kind of narrative and the tension. So the fact that she fails is also just it's such a beautiful kind of brilliant celebratory way that and it's a come to Jesus moment, since that she's surrounded by people who are basically I see her in a church, and people are surrounding and praying with her but as they're kind of going and spying on her.
Interesting. Speaking of Marjories, you have a Marjorie character who's interesting because she's kind of both a friend and an antagonist to one of your characters. And there's a theme I saw in your collection in general, especially in the first half, of people who really, really are trying to be loved and want love. And it goes back to the title, The Invention of Love. And they end up settling because they can't get what they want for these micro moments of like a substitution for love. So in one story, it ends up with a character just holding Marjorie's hand, and that seems to fulfill all of these huge desires about her work and her relationship and her previous relationships that she hasn't been able to actually get. There's a character who's happy for her artwork to be smudged, and that feels like a substitution for the love that she really wants. She's sleeping with a gay man instead of the man she really wants to sleep with, who the gay man is in love with. And she'll just sort of take what she can get from this woman who smudges her artwork, and even the attention she gets from an accident, and I won't spoil that accident. But that seems to be a recurring theme, like accepting substitutions for love, and then these really understated endings. So can you talk more about both of those things, the theme and how you approach those endings?
I had, that's super smart reading. I think that there is something about the idea that the title, which is the story about the character kind of being pleased by her drawings being smudged, is that the love of throughout the collection is not necessarily, true love or true romantic love or true self-love, but it's kind of like a proximity, a simulacra of love, and so I think, the very first story is a character kind of reflecting on her 90s college self and how she looked forward and how everything seemed open and wonderful. And then I think the rest of the stories are about how that was a kind of an illusion, especially if you were, white in college, like looking forward in the 90s, you're like every things seemed kind of possible. And then gradually I think what I'm interested in exploring is this idea of kind of letting go of the previous dreams of what oneself could be, and both still striving a little bit for something different, but also accepting that some of the characters more happily than others, that what they have is what they have, like holding Marjorie's hand. I don't think she's actually I don't think she's happy with that. That's just her, that's what she's got, and that's what she's, and the young woman, I actually think with the young woman who's pleased with her drawings being smudged, I think for her, it's a little more kind of hopeful to me, that I think that she's like realizing that art can be made and remade, and this is a new, having someone else be kind of physically engaged with her work enough to kind of smudge the drawings is a kind of physical connection to a person, and to be admired and to have your drawings be admired is. But yeah, endings. I love endings. I'm glad we're talking about endings because I love your endings too. Yeah, I mean, I think for me that I know when I have a story more when I have an idea of how it's going to end a little bit, and it often changes. But what I often have to write the ending multiple times, but I really love endings that have have a sense of movement, both physically and emotionally or mentally. So so for example, at the end of the workshop, the characters are just sitting around the table at their workshop, but the light is changing, and the writer, the old professor, is kind of aware of the lights going down outside the windows of the classroom. And it's also there's a physical thing happening in the world, but then there's also this resistance to admitting that he is the end. No, this is the end of his era of ruling the workshop, kind of. So there's like an intellectual movement, sense of movement, and then a kind of a physical sense of movement. So I don't know if I'm always completely aware that I'm doing that with each story, but I always love stories that I'm reading that do that. I was just rereading Go Tell It on the Mountain, Baldwin's first novel, and just the end when Johnny has just gone through this spiritual transformation, and it's been pages long of being in his head, and going both a spiritual transformation and also his relationship with his stepfather has changed, and then just the most perfect ending is on the heels of that, looking up at his mother in the window and telling her that he's coming up, that he's on his way. So it's like he's physically going to be moving up there, and he's looking at his mother, and there's also all these layers of what coming up means, given the journey that we've watched him on. So yeah, and I see that I love your endings too. I often feel like your endings come right after I have just kind of my whole physical interiority just kind of crushed for a moment. Like I can't breathe, and I feel, and then there's like this beautiful kind of open, or it's like a hinge too. I think I see that like there's something really pivotal, and then you kind of, you get end to end gently while still that lingering impact of that kind of punch feeling or that hinge feeling. So how do you work on your endings?
I love what you said about yours with a physical transformation or a physical movement and a spiritual one. I like that idea, and I think I try to approach them similarly, but what most informs my endings is the idea of punch. I like that you said a punch. When I teach endings to my grad students and undergrads, I always talk about good endings having either something really beautiful and lyrical in them, or a gut punch or a punch line. And I feel like I always do the gut punch or the punchline because I'm not good at the lyrical thing. But I've been really informed by Guy de Maupassant and Kate Chopin, the way that they write endings. I think that they always do something that just feels like you've been punched in the gut. It's a surprise, but it's not. And if you go back and
Does
read,
anyone have a
obvious
connection?
Oh, you might want to mute your microphone. It's always a thing that comes from something that the story's already been building toward, and that I think feels like if you read it again, there's foreshadowing towards it, but it ultimately really punches you in some way. And that's what I think is fun to read. That's what I think is fun to write too, because I often have to rewrite my endings in the same way that you do. And getting to that place always feels really good. It feels like the story's finally ready.
Oh, that's the best feeling, isn't it? When you know that you got it. Just nothing better. Yeah, and then when you get that kind of ending, and that your endings are like uniformly like evocative in that way for me, like where I get punched and I can't stop thinking, it keeps ringing in my head. Or once you punch someone with an ending, it lingers beyond the page too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I really love that about your work. Should we talk a little bit, since you're talking about what you teach and how you teach endings, should we talk a little bit about how we teach and how we do not keep perpetuating the style of the professor at the end of the workshop, or the guy who doesn't want us to write meta?
So many of those guys. Yeah. I mean, I think a really basic teaching philosophy is, if you've ever seen that Twitter page or that Twitter account, that guy in your MFA workshop, yes. I think that's the name of it.
Yeah.
Don't be that as a professor. Like, that's the thing you don't want to perpetuate. But I think there's a kind of snobbery in a lot of MFA workshops that is passed down, and it's so countered. It, like, my whole body just rejects that and wants to be completely rebellious toward it. And I don't want to teach that way. I don't want to make other people feel the way I have sometimes felt. And so a big part of my teaching philosophy and the way I approach pedagogy in general is just the ethics that I want to live by. And that's to make sure you're looking for the person who's least likely to be paid attention to. Make sure you're always checking out for them, and that you're teaching toward them too, not the people who are like, I've got it, I'm set. That's a really obnoxious perspective to have. You're always trying to learn, and teaching toward the person who seems the most anxious about it, who seems the least likely to be heard or to speak up, I think is a smart way to engage the whole class ultimately, because you're modeling the kind of behavior that you want the workshop environment to create. And so do no harm is a big part of my teaching philosophy. I know that's not from teaching, but I think it should be, that we're not doing harm, and that we're constantly thinking about representation and whether the work we're writing does harm. I think it's okay if a story makes someone mad or hurts their feelings a little bit because they've never wanted to think about this, but a story shouldn't make you feel burned, or that you've experienced the reproduction of harm that's been done to you. And I don't mean that as the same as being triggered. A story should and can sometimes, I don't mean to say should, a story can sometimes trigger, old memories and things like that, but it shouldn't make you feel as though you've been abused, or as though you've read a representation that is racist, sexist, queer-phobic, any of those things. And so we talk constantly, for instance, about who should or can write certain kinds of stories. Is it ethical at all to write across racial or sexual or sexuality differences? And if you are going to choose to do that, what are the best practices for writing if you choose to do it? And I give my students so much work to do building up to that. We always talk about race, we foreground sexuality, we foreground terms that are ableist and how not to use ableist language. And then we go back to, if you choose to still write in a tradition that's not your own, here's all the research you have to do. And I make the research so big that you really can't do it in a semester, to kind of help them realize that, Zora Neale Hurston, even though she was a Black woman, she wrote dialect with so much respect. She studied it as an anthropologist, literally, before she attempted to write dialect. So if you're a white kid from the Midwest trying to write dialect for a Black character, you need to do the same sort of anthropological study that Zora Neale Hurston did, in addition to reading all the literature that's come before you. Not just go, well, I have a friend who kind of sounds like this, and that's why I wrote it. That's not enough. That is not enough. And so I make them think of it as kind of empirical study. Have you done all the work you need to do to make sure that your work is not going to be harmful? And I try again constantly to make sure that I'm not being harmful in the kind of feedback I give. And if I am, that my students can let me know and I will change. You know, I'll always be willing to change if it's an appropriate request, because I think that's the only way we don't act like the man in the end of the workshop.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Like, I think I love that the do no harm phrase, and I think I might take that and I mean, I think about it when I'm teaching, but I don't necessarily use that with my students, you know. But it's, yeah, it's really so critical. And I think I also, when I am planning out my my syllabi and the curriculum, I'm just teaching undergraduate. So, and at SUNY Plattsburgh, I don't have too many who already think that they've made it. So I don't have a lot of, I don't have a lot of the pretension that I've had in other institutions, but, and they tend to be really open to just, hey, you know, my professors have something to teach me, but I do see that it's my job to, like you said, kind of front load what we're going to be talking about, and to teach them. We're going to be talking about gender. We're going to be talking about race and racism, and I'm going to use those words because a lot of white students I've taught when on the first couple of days when we're whether it's a nonfiction class or a fiction class, they're really nervous about even just saying racism. Like they don't want to point it out. They don't want to. So I feel like I'm designing my syllabus and how I model teaching to them to say this exists. Systemic racism and misogyny exists, and we're actually going to talk about that. You know, we can't talk about Edward P. Jones' work if we're afraid to talk about Black DC culture and you know, and so we actually have to name what we're talking about. But I also feel like I have to design my syllabi and my readings for students of color, for marginalized students, who just to see that there are voices that are going to inspire us, and who are, you know, as models of what is possible to write about too. So I feel like my syllabus has to both be instructive to kids who don't know how to talk about race, misogyny, homophobia, ableism, yeah, and then really talk about it. And then I feel like students are, that's the scaffolding that happens before we have to write. Yeah, I think it's just absolutely critical.
Sorry.
What's that?
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
No.
I was just going to say, it's so weird that there's like this generational space that's between generations that really is afraid to say race or racism. And I'm like, is this a Common Core thing? Like, where did it come from? Because you have to call out those things. You can't be colorblind. Colorblindness makes it so that you ignore all the problems in the world. And it seems like they've come up with colorblind rhetoric that even, I taught a group of kids one summer, and it was horrific. I know I shouldn't teach kids now, but they used me like I was in middle school. But what they always said when I talked about race was, that's racist. And I would say, like, talking about race isn't racist. Saying somebody's Black isn't racist, it's descriptive, you know? Saying that they're a stereotype or calling them a racial slur, that's racist. But just saying race, or just mentioning that this story is racialized, is not racist. And there was a real conflation of the terms and such a fear of talking about those things. And I think we're getting better. It's kind of hard to be a kid now, I think, or an undergrad, and not have this in your face. I had a really almost ideal magical class my last semester at Illinois, which would have been over a year ago,
Yeah.
where it was all white students except 2, but they were so ready to talk about this. And I think students often are hungry for it. They're just scared, really scared. And some of them wrote stories that were racist, but the class called them out in a way that was gentle yet firm. And the white students all apologized for it. They came back with better work. They apologized to me. They issued written apologies. They were really trying hard to make sure that they weren't being harmful, even though they messed up in a particular story. And I think adults can learn from that. You know, these people are 18, 19, 22 max, and they were still super adaptive and willing to do the work. And I think a lot of people are either not willing to do the work, or they've let fear undermine their ability to do it. And it's unfortunate.
I am finding this a similar thing with students do seem ready, but again, there's that generation, what you're talking about, that generation gap, the people who are teaching our kids. You know, my daughter's in 2nd grade, and she's had lovely teachers from kindergarten, it's very sweet, but I'm appalled by how they don't talk about race. You know, I wrote to her, the principal, and sent a couple of references for talking about the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests, and there are protests happening here in Plattsburgh, so these kids are gonna know about them. No, they had like the last penultimate week of school, all the kids were listening to Kristen Bell read from her book about how we need more purple people.
Oh gosh, I heard about that book, but I'm not going to read it.
No, I'm not gonna. Yeah. So I think that it's the teachers too who are not. They have no idea. They're not adept in talking about race. They're not. They're scared too. Some of them, you know, there's varying degrees of racism in rural upstate New York, as you will be getting more and more familiar with. So there are folks who just don't believe that they should talk about it, you know, here, and then folks who I know just are afraid of messing up, and then there are people who are afraid of angering the contingent of parents whose main goal is, like, every year is to show up at Flag Day, where the kids are supposed to sing like 40 songs. 40 patriotic songs. We told our daughter's teachers early on, she's not doing this. She's not learning 40 God Bless America. We're just not, you know, in her music class. But yeah, I think they're worried about angering that kind of crowd. So the kids come to college, you know, and if they've been through this kind of system, they've had a colorblind education.
So harmful. I'm trying to write a memoir. I grew up in Southern California, and I went to predominantly white Christian school for my whole life, until my senior year, where I begged my parents to let me go to public school, and I was finally free. Wow. And it was wonderful. But until that point, you know, I had a completely colorblind education too. And when people would say racial slurs, I remember this harshly and as a moment of trauma. We had a whole white supremacist group at my school, and this was around the time of Columbine. And I'd grown up with those kids since elementary, and they suddenly decided, after watching, of all things, American History X, that they wanted to be racist. They wanted to be white supremacist. And nobody cared about this at all in my school. And when they started calling people names, racial slurs, I went to the principal, who also had known me my whole life. I used to go to her house all the time to hang out with her daughter, who was in my grade. She said to me, and this is a direct quote, "Nafissa, Black people can often be racist too." No checking of any of the other stuff that I said, just that, and sent me on my way. And I suddenly started getting more dress code violations after that for shorts that were just like this much too short. And it was so ugly. And it was one of the reasons I realize now that I wanted to flee that school, but I'd kind of repressed all of that. And a colorblind education just made all those people, this is an ableist term, but stupider, for lack of a better word. It didn't help them in any way. It's not equipping them to be good, ethical people in their jobs now, or in serving the students that they now work with. Some of them are school counselors of all people. And it's really ugly. You have to engage this stuff, and from the youngest level, or else you're not really doing anything in the world but harm, even if you think you're the sweetest person.
Yeah, you're just teaching that, again, like this has come up a lot in the past week, just that you're just teaching that the word racist is bad. And being called racist is bad. You're not teaching like what you know, about what layers of racism exist, and that we are all part and growing up in a racist society. So yeah, it really just takes the, I mean, and I think that as and higher ed has a problem with this too, because we've got you know, progressive professors and people who see themselves as bastions and beacons of progressivism. And so I think, like, in terms of when we talk about changing the workshop and do no harm, it has to be, that philosophy has to be embraced, you know, by people who already see themselves, you know, kind of as being progressive. So there's just so much work to do. Like, I was just listening to this interview with the Minnesota activist Brittany Lewis talking to Angela Davis, and she said that Minnesota progressives, for Minnesota progressives, the word equality is equal to the word the. Like, it's so common and it's just meaningless. And I feel like in higher ed, diversity and inclusion is the same kind of thing. You know, we talk about it a lot, but it loses its meaning when a committee is sitting around going, oh, does this class check all the boxes for our diversity and inclusion classes?
And that's all.
Yeah.
It has to also move to retention and support. Black students and students of color put so much labor on the few faculty of color because the university isn't employing enough of them to spread that work around. And so we do so much invisible labor. We're counselors, we're doing the work of 3 or 4 jobs in addition to trying to get tenure and then move up to full professor, because our students are so hungry and they're not being fed, and there needs to be a full infrastructure to support all kinds of students and not just say that we ticked a box for our numbers or our quota of diversity.
Yeah, exactly. Well, your students are really lucky.
So are yours, truly. And your daughter, to not have to sing those flag songs, good for her.
Yeah, she always has there's always a point at the beginning of the year where she tells the teacher asks, like, why are you not saying the pledge? She's like, well, I don't have to.
Right on.
The Supreme Court said. So, yes.
I was that student, so I'm very proud to see a 2nd grader who's doing this work. Yeah.
Yes, I was too in high school. I never said, people always thought, why are you not saying the words? Listen to the words, guys, you're not listening.
There was no liberty and justice for all, so I would be telling a lie. That's why I wouldn't say it. Yeah.
Exactly. Oh. How are we doing it for time, Eleanor?
Yeah, I was going to say it's just after 8. I don't know how you guys are feeling about if you want to take any questions or not. I think we've gotten a lot out of just the conversation, but if you want to give a couple more minutes, if anyone has any questions, I don't know.
Yeah, I'm fine. If people do, and if they don't, that's fine too. But yeah, I'd totally be happy to.
Does anybody have anything to ask or comment on? See, I told you, you guys did such a good job in conversation that there's nothing left unsaid. We really, you guys, it was really a great conversation. I think it's a perfect combination of all that I personally love about literature and fiction, in that it can bring up all of these things about society, about teaching, about what we're all contemplating every given day, as well as how you craft your craft. So it was a really nice balance of all those things. We really appreciated it. Thank you so much. And for everyone else who's watching, we have a couple of other great events coming up through June and July. And I think our next event for anybody with small children is our Drag Queen Story Hour on the last Sunday of the month at noon, with Coraline Chardonnay and Tilia Cordata. It's always a lot of fun. And then we have our local Well-Read Black Girl Book Club, which is coordinated by the bookstore, and along with Southside Community Center. Dr. Nia Nunn leads the conversation. And we're reading Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half right now. So good.
Wonderful.
Yeah, and Nafissa, after reading Britt Bennett, I was like, I'm finally going to go read Passing too. So I'm reading
Oh, yeah.
Passing. So it'll be a great conversation if anybody wants to join us for that. All that information's on our website. And then in July, a young Cornell student who works with me has organized an entire week of young adult author readings that are with a lot of really amazing authors, turning everything upside down. All kinds of queer and I don't even know. So many cool authors and great books. So keep an eye on our website and our social media for upcoming events. But again, thank you guys so much. And I look forward to seeing those of you who are around in the bookstore soon. We're going to try to open up July 1st. We'll see how that goes. And definitely virtually through our events from now on. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you, Eleanor. And Nafissa, I am just so grateful that you did this, that we got to do this together, and that we're like chatting, and now we're, friends.
Yeah.
So grateful. This book is so amazing. Please buy.
Yes, and both books can be bought at buffalostreetbooks.com.
Yeah.
And I love your book, Sarah.
Or from Black bookstores. Thank you guys.
Yes, Black booksellers too, but Buffalo Street. I don't have your picture of your book, so it's on my Kindle. Yeah.
Thank you all. Good night.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye.
much. Bye.